Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. My name is Jennifer, and I am 30 years old. I've been married to Charles for 6 years, and at first glance, our life seems perfect. A cozy house in the suburbs, shared interests, long evening walks. But no one knows what hides behind these walls. No one suspects that our marriage began to crack at the seams as soon as Robert, my husband's father, came into our home. He arrived with the pain of loss, carrying his secret, and unexpectedly awakened something within me that I had long forgotten. I don't even understand how we got here, but every morning, while making breakfast in the kitchen, I can feel his gaze upon me. It all began so subtly. I don't know how my life reached this point, but when I look back, it seems everything was destined from the very beginning. The morning began as usual. I stood by the kitchen counter, preparing breakfast for Charles and myself. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, playing reflections on the countertop and illuminating the garden outside. I loved watching the wind sway the branches of the trees and imagining the flowers in the garden stretching towards the sun. This was my little world, my cozy corner, where I always felt at peace. Charles walked into the kitchen, tucking his shirt into his trousers. He looked focused, as he always did in the mornings when getting ready for work. I smiled at him, trying not to show my anxiety. "Good morning," I said, attempting to sound cheerful. "The coffee is ready. How did you sleep?" He glanced at me briefly and nodded. "Great, thank you. I have a meeting at the office today. I might be late," he replied, quickly taking a sip of coffee. I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. His frequent late nights at work had become the norm, and I felt like an invisible barrier had formed between us. I didn't know how to break it, and he didn't seem to notice it at all. "All right, I'll wait for you for dinner," I said, turning to the stove so he wouldn't see my face. At that moment, Robert entered the kitchen. He had come to stay with us 2 weeks ago after his wife had passed away, and I had been trying to get used to his presence in our home ever since. He was much older than Charles, about 20 years, with gray hair and wrinkles around his eyes that seemed to mark the passage of years. But there was something else about him, something I couldn't quite describe. "Good morning, children," he said with a slight smile, sitting down at the table. "Jennifer, it smells wonderful, as always." "Thank you, Robert," I replied, feeling a slight shiver run down my spine. I didn't know what unsettled me more, his compliment or the way he looked at me so intently. "Dad, how are you feeling today?" Charles asked, trying to sound caring, but there was a certain tension in his voice. The death of his mother had left a deep wound in him, but he and his father had never been particularly close. Robert merely shrugged. "As usual, a bit tired. But I'm feeling better, thank you. Your home is truly an oasis of peace." I watched their conversation and felt a certain coldness between them. I didn't know what to do, how to help them get closer. It seemed like their relationship had always been so distant. We started eating breakfast, and I tried to keep the conversation light, talking about a new project for my blog. Robert listened with interest, asking questions, while Charles just quietly chewed his toast, lost in his thoughts. "Jennifer, you always tell such fascinating stories," Robert said, smiling at me. "Your blog must be quite popular?" "Yes," I replied, feeling myself blush under his attention. "I enjoy doing it. It's like creating coziness in people's homes, even if I don't know them." "You have a real talent," he added, and his eyes lingered on mine a bit longer than usual. Charles suddenly looked up from his plate and gave us a quick glance before returning to his meal. I sensed a slight tension in the air, but I tried not to make too much of it. When Charles left for work, I was left alone with Robert. He sat at the table, gently swirling his coffee cup, and I suddenly realized I didn't know how to behave with him. We rarely found ourselves alone. "Robert, don't you think that he seems a bit distant lately?" I asked cautiously. Robert nodded. his gaze becoming more serious. He's dealing with things in his own way. You know, Jennifer, I've made many mistakes in my life, and one of the biggest was not trying to understand my son. It feels like I'm missing the chance to make it right now. I fell silent, trying to process his words. Robert had always seemed so strong and confident to me, but now I saw pain and regret in his eyes. I think he appreciates that you're here, I said softly. It's just that he's not used to showing his feelings. Yes, perhaps you're right, Robert replied, and his gaze lingered on me again. Thank you, Jennifer, for supporting me. I really need it right now. I smiled and stood up to clear the dishes. But inside, something began to change. I couldn't understand what exactly, but the feeling that I was thinking about Robert more and more often didn't leave me. Each day, his presence in our home became more noticeable, and perhaps that's where it all began. The weekend promised to be calm. We decided to go to the country house, a small but cozy cabin surrounded by dense forest. I had always loved this place. It was so quiet that even my thoughts seemed to slow down. But this time, I felt a strange restlessness. Maybe it was because Robert was coming with us. Charles was busy all day with phone calls and checking work documents. He had promised to give us his full attention this time, but, as always, work took over. I decided not to dwell on it, even though a slight frustration was already boiling inside me. Jen, I'm still on the phone, he called out to me from the porch as we arrived. Maybe you and Dad can start without me. I'll join you soon. Of course, dear, I replied, trying to hide my irritation. Robert and I headed to the veranda. It had needed repairs for years. The paint was peeling, the boards creaked underfoot, and moss grew in the corners. Jennifer, I can start by removing the old paint, and you can take care of the plants, Robert suggested, nodding toward the ivy that wound around the wooden railings. That sounds like a plan, I agreed, picking up a pair of pruning shears. We worked in silence, but it wasn't an awkward silence. On the contrary, it felt natural. Occasionally, I noticed Robert glancing at me, and each time, I felt a slight tingling in my stomach. What was it? Nervousness? Fear? I couldn't quite understand. After a while, he stopped and looked at me. You seem like a professional at this, he said, smiling. You've barely started, and you've already cleared half of it. It's more out of necessity, I replied with a shrug. If you don't do something yourself, no one else will do it for you. You're right, he nodded. Sometimes you have to take everything into your own hands, especially when no one else wants to or can help. Are you talking about yourself? I asked, sensing a hint of hidden meaning in his words. Robert paused for a moment, then continued with a slight smile. Maybe. You know, after my wife died, I realized how much I hadn't noticed. I was so immersed in my work and worries for so long that I missed important moments with those I loved. Now that I have time, I'm trying to find myself again and to understand those around me. I felt his words penetrate my heart. I knew there was a lot of pain in his eyes, but only now was I beginning to understand how deep that wound was. I think you understand a lot already, Robert, I replied softly, even more than anyone else. He looked at me and held my gaze for a moment before returning to his task. You know, Jennifer, you are an incredible woman, he suddenly said, continuing to scrape off the old paint. You don't fear challenges, even when no one notices. His words caught me off guard. I felt my heart quicken and my cheeks started to burn. Thank you, Robert, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. That's nice to hear. A few minutes passed, and the silence between us was once again filled with a strange tension. The forest around us was quiet. Only the wind played in the leaves, and this sound seemed almost soothing. I heard Robert sigh quietly and decided to break the silence. Maybe we should take a break, I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. There's an old bench here, and I could make us something cool to drink. Robert smiled and nodded. Great idea. We can also discuss the renovation plan. I went to the kitchen, trying not to rush, though I wasn't sure what exactly I was afraid of. I quickly made lemonade and returned to the veranda. We sat on the bench, and I handed him a glass. He thanked me and took a sip. Jennifer, I often think about how quickly life changes, he began, looking into the distance, as if trying to catch a thought. I spent so many years not noticing things that were right in front of me. And now, I feel like a new chance has appeared in my life. I think you deserve that chance, Robert, I said, trying to understand where he was going with this. He looked at me with an expression, as if he wanted to say something important, but then he turned away. You know, Jennifer, he finally said, sometimes it seems to me that you see me as I forgot I could be. And that makes me happy. I fell silent, feeling his words weigh heavily on my shoulders. What was he trying to say? What did I see in him that Charles did not? Or was this just his way of getting my attention? I didn't know what to think, but I felt something between us beginning to change. Charles still hadn't joined us, and time seemed to pass slowly, like thick syrup. I stood up to continue trimming the plants, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our conversations were becoming more personal than they should be. I didn't know how to stop it, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. Robert, I finally said, trying to change the subject, let's see how we can best arrange these flower pots. Maybe you have some ideas on how they would best fit the decor? He smiled and stepped closer. Of course, Jennifer. I'd be happy to help. We continued to work, but a silent tension hung between us, something that couldn't be expressed in words. I felt like we were both playing with fire, and I couldn't figure out how it would all end. Charles came out of the house an hour later. My pulse quickened, as if I had been caught doing something forbidden, but he looked tired and didn't seem to notice that anything was amiss. So, did you manage to get anything done without me? He asked, smiling, though his eyes were still lost in thoughts of work. Of course, dear, I replied, trying to sound cheerful. We've almost finished. Robert chimed in. Yes, Charles, your wife is doing a great job. I think we'll finish sooner than expected. I noticed Robert give me a quick glance before turning away again. That day on the veranda had changed something in our dynamic. I didn't know where it would lead, but I felt that something beneath the surface was beginning to emerge. Evening at the country house arrived quickly, almost unexpectedly. We had finished working on the veranda, and I decided it was time to clean the attic. The attic had long served as a storage space for everything accumulated over the years. Old photo albums, things left from Charles's grandmother, broken furniture we never threw away. There was always a bit of a mess up there, and I had been meaning to tidy it up for a while. Charles, as usual, was busy. He came up to me, quickly kissed me on the cheek, and said, I'm heading to the store, Jen. We're running out of groceries, and you know how much I hate an empty fridge. I smiled at him, but I felt a twinge of disappointment. He could have stayed to help, spend a little time together, but he chose to leave again. Perhaps it was my fault. I let him go with these little things too often, trying to be an understanding wife. When he left, I turned to Robert, who was sitting on the porch, enjoying the warm evening air. Robert, I called a little hesitantly, would you like to go up to the attic? I need to sort a few things out, and I could use some help. He smiled and nodded, something interested flickering in his eyes. Of course, Jennifer, why not? I haven't climbed up to an attic in ages. It will be something to remember. We climbed the narrow staircase, and I switched on the string lights hung on the walls. They were old lanterns that Charles and I used at picnics and parties, and now their soft light filled the attic with a warm, cozy glow. Haven't seen so many old things in one place for a while, Robert said with a smile, looking around. I feel like an archaeologist. I laughed. In a way, we are archaeologists. Look, here's everything that's ever been in this family. Everything has its own story, its own memories. Robert walked over to a box of photographs and began flipping through one of the albums. I couldn't help but notice how carefully he examined each picture. I moved closer to glance at the photos. "That's Charles when he was little," I said, pointing to a picture. "He was always so serious, even as a child." Robert smiled. His eyes softened. "Yes, he was always thoughtful. My wife often said he took after me, but now he seems more like his mother." I felt a light, almost imperceptible warmth develop between us. We were standing so close that I could feel his breath. I looked at his face, trying to understand what he was thinking. "You often speak of her," I said carefully. "It seems you loved her very much." Robert was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, she was a special woman. But, you know, Jennifer, sometimes I think I didn't love her enough, or the right way. I spent so much time working, missing important moments. And now I regret it." I felt the pain hidden in those words. We continued to flip through the photographs, occasionally laughing at the funny moments captured in the pictures. I didn't know how it happened, but our shoulders touched, and suddenly it became hard to breathe. We moved on to an old box full of books and letters. Robert pulled out an envelope, and his gaze became distant. "This was her letter to me," he said quietly. "The last thing she wrote before." I looked at him. There was a shadow of memories in his eyes, and I felt a strong urge to hug him, to comfort him. But instead, I just said, "Robert, you are not alone. We are all here with you." He turned to me, his gaze filled with gratitude and something else I couldn't quite understand. We were standing close, too close, and I felt his presence with every fiber of my being. "You are very kind to me, Jennifer," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Sometimes I feel like I don't deserve it." I didn't know what to say. All I could do was look into his eyes and feel something stirring inside me, like waves under the wind. Our faces were just a few inches apart, and I noticed his gaze drop to my lips. My head swirled with emotions, and before I knew what I was doing, I leaned closer. Our lips met. It was a light, quick kiss, almost accidental. But I felt a spark run through my whole body. I pulled back, shocked by my own actions. "I'm sorry, I began, unable to find the right words. But Robert said nothing. He just looked at me, as if trying to understand what had just happened. His eyes were full of surprise and perhaps some relief. "Jennifer," he whispered softly, I. We fell silent again, and time seemed to stand still. Inside me, a storm was raging. I realized I had made a mistake, but I couldn't tear myself away from his gaze. "We should stop," I whispered, but my words sounded too weak to convince even myself. Robert nodded, but didn't move away. His hand was still on my shoulder, and it seemed he wasn't going to let go. I felt that something had changed between us, something unspoken, yet palpable, that would now always hang in the air. "Let's just forget about this," I said, but I knew it would be impossible. Robert slowly removed his hand and finally nodded. "Yes, you're right. We should forget." But his eyes said otherwise, and I realized that things would never be the same between us. We had already crossed that line from which there is no return. We moved to different parts of the attic, pretending to continue with our tasks. But my heart was still pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something very important and frightening had just happened. I didn't know how to live with this. But one thing was clear. Everything had changed now, and there was no turning back. The morning after Robert and I shared that kiss in the attic, I tried to behave as usual. Charles seemed not to have noticed anything. He was full of energy and suggested we go fishing at a nearby lake. "Let's go fishing. It'll be fun," he said as he walked into the kitchen, his smile seeming to light up the whole room. "Let's take a break from all our worries." "Oh, I'm not sure that's a good idea," I began, feeling a tightness in my chest. I knew I didn't want to be alone with Charles, not today. I think I'll stay here and rest for a bit. Charles seemed to pay no attention to my reluctance. He just shrugged and turned to Robert. Hey, Dad, what about you? Are you coming? He asked. Robert glanced at me briefly and then, with a barely noticeable smile, replied, You know, Charles, I think I'll stay too. I'm a bit tired from yesterday, but you go ahead, enjoy yourself, and catch something for dinner. Charles snorted, but didn't argue. All right, I'll leave you two here. I'll be back in a couple of hours, no more, he said, and then left, taking his fishing gear with him. As soon as the door closed behind Charles, an awkward silence hung in the air. I tried not to look at Robert, but I could feel his gaze on me. Well, it seems like it's just the two of us, he finally said with a light chuckle. I tried to smile, but all I managed was a nervous twitch of my lips. Yeah, I guess it is, I replied, rubbing my hands as if trying to warm them. Maybe we could relax a little? Go to the pool? Robert nodded, and we headed to the pool together. The water was pleasant, cool, and inviting. We changed into our swimsuits, and I dove in first. Robert followed, and for a while, we just swam without speaking. Finally, he swam closer and asked, Are you all right after yesterday? I felt my heart start to pound harder. I had expected him to bring it up, but I didn't know what to say. I don't know, I replied, lowering my gaze to the water. It was unexpected. He nodded, frowning slightly. Yes, unexpected, he repeated, moving a bit closer. But I don't regret it, Jennifer. Truly, I don't. His words struck me. Not that I expected anything different, but this admission changed something inside me. I'm not sure if I regret it either, I said without raising my head. But maybe I should. We were standing so close in the water that I could feel the warmth of his body even in the cool pool water. I couldn't understand how this had happened, how we had come to this. But now I could no longer ignore the fire burning inside me. Robert, as if sensing my confusion, said, You know, Jennifer, I don't think I've felt so alive in a long time. I don't want to hurt you or Charles, but I also can't ignore what I feel. I looked into his eyes. There was no guile in them, only sincerity and confusion. I knew he was telling the truth, and maybe that was why I was so scared. We both knew we were standing on the edge, and the next step could change everything. I don't know what to do, Robert, I whispered, feeling tears rising in my throat. This is wrong, but I can't stop it. He gently took my hand. His touch was warm, but I could feel him trembling. Then maybe we shouldn't try? He whispered. I didn't have time to respond. Our faces were so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. And then, before I could think, our lips met again. We pulled away from each other, and I saw the same fear in his eyes that I felt in mine. Neither of us knew what to say, but I knew this was not the end, but only the beginning of something new, something we both feared and desired at the same time. Jennifer, he said, his voice shaking, I don't know how we got here, but I know one thing. You're the only one who makes me feel alive. Tears filled my eyes, and I replied, Robert, I don't know what to do, but I feel the same way. He nodded, his gaze remaining fixed on my face. I could see his own emotions battling inside him. We both knew we were standing on the edge of an abyss, but we couldn't step back. We need to figure out what to do next, I said quietly. We can't go on like this. Yes, he agreed. We need to sort this out. But no matter what happens, Jennifer, I don't want to lose you. Not now. I nodded slowly. My thoughts were in turmoil, but one thing I knew for sure. We had crossed a line, and there was no way back. The feelings growing between us had become too strong to ignore. Charles returned a little later than he had promised. He came into the backyard with his fishing gear and a satisfied smile on his face. Hope you two weren't too bored? He called cheerfully, oblivious to the tension still hanging in the air. I smiled, trying to appear as relaxed as possible. No, of course not, I replied, hiding my thoughts behind a familiar smile. We had a good time. Robert just nodded and smiled back, but his eyes said something different. We both knew this was not the end, but only the beginning, and I couldn't even imagine where it would all lead. The next day, I woke up with a heavy heart. Ever since Robert and I kissed by the pool, all my thoughts had been focused on him. Every morning, I woke up with a sense of anxiety, and every evening, I fell asleep trying to convince myself that it was all just a mistake. But the feelings did not go away. They only grew stronger. I felt a sense of relief at his absence, although I knew I was ashamed of my thoughts. Ever since we arrived at the cottage, I had increasingly wanted to be alone with Robert. I needed to talk to him, to figure out what to do next, how to move forward. I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee, when Robert entered. He looked thoughtful and tense, as if he, too, was wrestling with some inner demons. We need to talk, he said quietly, approaching me. But not here. I nodded, understanding what he meant. Charles was lying in the bedroom and could overhear the conversation. We decided to go to the garage, an old building on the edge of the property where no one would hear our words. Let's go to the garage. It will be safer there, Robert suggested, and I agreed, feeling a knot of anticipation and fear tightening in my stomach. The garage was dark and cool. The smell of old metal and oil hung in the air. I closed the door behind me and stood across from Robert, feeling his presence filling the space around us. We need to make a decision, Jennifer, he began, looking into my eyes. We can't go on pretending nothing is happening. It's not fair. To us. Or to Charles. I know, I replied quietly, biting my lip. But what can we do? What kind of options do we even have? Robert took a deep breath, his face growing serious. The only way is to be honest. With ourselves and with him, he said. We need to decide if we want to be together, and if we're ready to destroy everything around us to make that happen. A cold fear swept through me. It all sounded so simple, but I knew it would actually be painfully difficult. Are you serious? I asked, trying to gauge how far he was willing to go. Do you really think we can just leave everything behind? Destroy Charles's life, our family, all for the sake of being together? Robert looked at me with a determination I hadn't expected to see. I don't know what's right, Jennifer, he said slowly, but I know I can't pretend anymore. I can't just live as if nothing is happening. We both know there's something real between us, something that can't just be erased. I felt his words penetrate deep into my heart. We stood so close that I could hear his breathing, and each of his words resonated within me. I don't know what to say, I admitted. I'm scared. I'm scared of what might happen. Charles is my husband. He means a lot to me, and I don't want to hurt him. Robert stepped closer, his eyes full of understanding and support. I understand, Jennifer, and I don't want that either. But we need to be honest with each other. We can't keep hiding and pretending everything is fine. We have to decide what we really want. I slowly nodded, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know if I can leave everything behind, I said honestly, but I know I can't keep ignoring what I feel for you. Robert gently took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. We can find a way, Jennifer. We can talk to Charles about it. It won't be easy, but maybe it will be the right thing to do. We have to think about what's best for all of us. I paused for a moment. My head was full of contradictions and doubts, but at the same time, I felt that Robert was right. We couldn't keep going on like this. We needed to decide what to do next. All right, I finally said. Let's talk to him, but only if you're sure this is what you really want. He nodded, his eyes filled with determination. I'm sure, Jennifer. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to live a lie. We stood in the garage, surrounded by old tools and dusty boxes, and I felt like I was on the brink of something new and frightening. We agreed to speak to Charles as soon as he returned, and I knew this conversation would change everything. Robert lingered for a moment longer, his eyes full of emotion. We'll get through this, he said quietly, squeezing my hand slightly. I nodded, although I wasn't sure of his words. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only thing keeping me from falling was his hand in mine. But all I knew was that something inevitable awaited us. We left the garage, and I saw Charles's car appear on the horizon. My heart started pounding faster again. I knew the decision had already been made, and now we just had to face the consequences. The day seemed ordinary. Charles was in a good mood, joking, laughing, and it seemed that he didn't notice the tension in the air between Robert and me. We tried to keep our distance, not to give ourselves away, but I felt that Charles sensed something, even if he couldn't quite grasp what it was. "Jen, I need to meet a friend tonight," Charles said during dinner. "I think I'll be back late. Don't wait up for me, just relax. It's going to be a bit of a guy's night," he added with a smile. I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety well up inside me. I exchanged a glance with Robert, and he seemed to understand my thoughts. We both knew this was our chance to be alone and finally figure out what was happening between us. We silently agreed. The evening would be the moment of truth. "All right, darling, don't worry, I'll be fine," I replied, trying to keep calm. After dinner, Charles quickly got ready and, approaching me, kissed me on the cheek. "Don't be too lonely without me," he said as he left. "I'll try not to be too late." "Good luck," I replied, watching his car drive away into the distance. We were left alone in the house. Inside, everything was boiling. I didn't know where to start or what to say. Robert came closer and quietly said, "Jennifer, this is our chance. We need to talk." "Yes," I replied, feeling my hands begin to tremble. "But where? Can we go to the veranda?" He nodded, and we headed to the veranda together. The quiet evening air filled the space around us, and I felt my heart start to beat faster. I knew this moment could be decisive. We sat down next to each other, and I looked at Robert and softly said, "We need to decide what to do next. We can't keep hiding." Robert nodded slightly, his eyes full of determination. "Jennifer," he began, "I don't want to pretend anymore. I love you. It hurts me to see you suffering, and I'm ready to do anything to be with you." These words struck me like lightning. I felt my eyes fill with tears. He was sincere, and that made everything even more difficult. "Robert, I love you too," I whispered, feeling a tear roll down my cheek. "But what about Charles? How can we do this to him?" He took my hand and squeezed it. "I know it will be hard," he answered gently. "But if we don't acknowledge our feelings, we'll be lying to ourselves and to him. We have to be honest." I closed my eyes, trying to collect my thoughts. It was hard. Too hard. We didn't know what lay ahead, but at that moment, in the silence of the veranda, we were together. And it felt right. He slowly leaned towards me, his lips touched mine, and I felt the tension ease. At that moment, everything seemed so clear. But suddenly, I heard the sound of a car, and my heart sank. We pulled away from each other, and I saw fear flare in Robert's eyes. "Is it Charles?" I whispered, hoping I was wrong. But no. Charles had returned to the cottage because his meeting with his friend had been canceled at the last moment. I saw his silhouette appear on the path to the house. My mind froze, and my heart was ready to jump out of my chest. I turned to Robert, and he was just as frightened as I was. "What is going on here?" Charles's voice was filled with surprise and anger. We froze. My lips were dry, and my head spun. I didn't know what to say. Robert also stood still, unmoving. "I asked, 'What is going on here?'" Charles repeated, his voice growing louder. Robert finally straightened up and took a step forward. "Charles, we need to talk," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "About what?" Charles stepped closer, his face pale, and his eyes burned with confusion and anger. "About how you're kissing here? I'm not blind. What does all this mean?" I felt tears well up in my eyes. "Charles, I'm sorry," I whispered. We, Robert and I, have feelings for each other. Charles froze, as if struck by lightning. His eyes widened, and he shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Feelings? He growled. Are you joking? Is this some sick joke? Robert stepped forward, trying to calm him down. Charles, listen, I understand how this looks, but… No, you don't understand anything, Charles exploded. How could you? How could you do this to me? I tried to approach him, but he stepped back, as if I were a leper. Charles, please listen to us. Listen to what, Jennifer? That you fell in love with my father? That it just happened? His voice trembled with anger and pain. You both disgust me. I don't want to see either of you anymore. With these words, he turned and quickly headed for his car. I shouted, Charles, please, wait! Give us a chance to explain. But he was no longer listening. He got into the car and slammed the door with a bang. I saw him close his eyes for a moment, as if trying to comprehend everything he had just learned. I'll file for a divorce, he shouted before starting the engine. And I hope I never see you again? The car roared and sped down the road, leaving Robert and me standing on the veranda in complete silence. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Everything I knew had been destroyed in an instant. I turned to Robert. He looked devastated, his eyes full of pain and regret. What have we done? I whispered, feeling my voice tremble. I don't know, Jennifer, he replied quietly, but now we have to live with this choice. We returned home the next morning, after everything fell apart in one moment on the veranda. Our decision seemed right at the time, but now all we felt was a painful emptiness and anxiety. Robert suggested that I stay with him until we figured out what to do next. I agreed, though I wasn't sure it would help either of us. We wanted to start fresh, but it felt like that blank page was already stained. Robert lived in an old house on the outskirts of the city. It was cozy, but I felt the walls closing in around us, constantly reminding us of what we had done. The first few days passed in silence. We were both trying to make sense of our feelings, but every morning I woke up with a sense of guilt and regret. I was sitting in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, but my hands were trembling and I couldn't concentrate. Robert walked into the room. His face looked as tired as mine. We hadn't slept much the night before, discussing what to do next, but by morning we had no answers, only more questions. Jennifer, he began, approaching me cautiously, we have to find a way to move forward. We have to give ourselves a chance. I sighed, turning away from the stove and looking into his eyes. There was so much pain, so much uncertainty in them. Robert, I don't know how we can do that, I confessed. I feel so guilty. I can't stop thinking about what we did to Charles, how we betrayed him. He nodded, his face darkening. I think about it all the time, too, he said quietly. But maybe, if we try to start over, if we're just honest with each other, we can somehow get through this? We tried. For the first few days, we focused on daily life, cooking dinners together, going for walks, trying to talk about the future. But every time our conversations turned to something more serious, to our plans, it felt like we were hitting an invisible wall. In the evenings, we sat on the couch, surrounded by silence. I could see that Robert was trying to remain calm, but his thoughts were far away. I didn't know what he was thinking about, but I could feel it was torturing him. I was afraid to ask. Do you think about him often? I finally asked one evening when we were sitting on the veranda of his house, watching the sunset. Robert was silent for a moment, then slowly nodded. Yes, I do, he admitted. I think about how much I let him down. How much I let you down, both of us. I knew he was right. We both felt like traitors, and the more we tried to hide it, the heavier it became. I thought we could start over, he continued, but now I'm not sure. Maybe we've gone too far, destroyed too much. I felt my eyes filling with tears. Do you think we made a mistake? I asked softly. He shook his head. No, Jennifer, he replied. I don't think my feelings for you are a mistake, but I think everything we did to arrive at these feelings, that was wrong. He exhaled slowly, looking away. I can't stop thinking about Charles, he continued. He's my son. I've lost his trust, maybe forever, and I feel like I have to try to fix it. My heart clenched at his words, but I knew he was right. Robert had always been someone who cherished his family, even if his relationship with Charles was complicated. And now, with everything so tangled, he was ready to do anything to restore what could be. Robert, I said, trying to keep the tears from falling down my cheeks. I understand. I understand why you want to do this. And maybe it's the right thing. He nodded, his eyes softening. I think we need to part ways, Jennifer, he said quietly. Not because I don't love you, but because I have to try to repair my relationship with my son. We both know we won't be able to move forward if we're constantly haunted by the past. I knew it was the right thing. I felt that we couldn't build our future on such a foundation. I didn't know if I could forgive myself for what had happened, and I knew that Robert wouldn't be able to either. Yes, I said, feeling the pain filling my soul. You're right. It will be better for both of us. He came closer and hugged me, his embrace firm yet gentle, as if he didn't want to let go but knew he had to. I will never forget you, Jennifer, he said. You changed my life, and I will always be grateful to you for that. With those words, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but at the same time, an emptiness settled in my chest. We both knew this was the end. We had tried to be together, but our past wouldn't leave us in peace, wouldn't allow us to be happy. I decided to return to my home and give myself time to sort out my feelings. Robert left me at his doorstep, and I knew this would be the last time we saw each other as we were. Now, he had to try to mend his relationship with Charles, and I had to find my way and try to forgive myself for what had happened. Our paths had diverged, but I knew that somewhere deep down, somewhere in a corner of memory, we would always have each other. It had been several weeks since Robert left. I returned to my home, which once felt so cozy and familiar, but now seemed strange and cold. Everything around me reminded me of the past, of what I had lost, and of what I could never get back. I thought I could cope, that perhaps time would heal the wounds, but every morning, waking up in an empty bed, I felt my soul sink deeper into despair. At first, I tried to distract myself, to find solace in familiar things. I kept writing in my blog, cleaning the house, trying to fill my time with something meaningful. But the more I tried to forget, the more acutely I felt the loneliness. Evenings became the hardest. I sat in the kitchen where Charles and I used to have dinner, laugh, and discuss our plans. Now, every sound in the house felt like an echo of emptiness. I tried to eat, but the food stuck in my throat. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. All my thoughts kept returning to the same thing. What have I done? How could I have destroyed my life and the lives of others so completely? I thought about Robert. I missed him, his calm voice, his confidence. But I thought even more about Charles. I remembered how he looked at me, how he loved me, how he believed in me, and how I betrayed him. Every thought of him was like a blow to the heart, a reminder of what I had lost. One evening, when darkness had already enveloped the house, I felt I could no longer endure this loneliness. I picked up the phone and dialed Charles's number, but instead of pressing the call button, I just held the phone in my hand, listening to my heavy breathing. What could I say to him? How could I apologize for something that could never be forgiven? I placed the phone on the table and closed my eyes, feeling the tears streaming down my cheeks again. I couldn't cry anymore, but the tears still came. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor in my bedroom, staring into the void, feeling my thoughts swirl like a vortex. The next day, I decided to leave the house, to take a walk around the city. I put on my coat and stepped outside. The fresh air cleared my thoughts a little, but the feelings of guilt and regret didn't leave me for a minute. I wandered the streets, as if in a fog, not noticing the people around me. The whole world seemed gray, empty, meaningless. I went into a small cafe, where Charles and I used to have lunch often. The place was almost empty. I sat at a table by the window and ordered a cup of coffee. The waitress smiled at me, but I couldn't even muster a smile in return. I had only one thought in my head. How could I have destroyed everything so completely? I stared out the window, watching the passers-by hurrying about their business, smiling, laughing. They seemed happy. They were living their lives, while mine had come to a standstill. The coffee grew cold in the cup, and I hadn't taken a single sip. I just sat there, in a state of complete numbness, feeling how the melancholy, slowly but surely, consumed me from within. A few days later, I received a message from Robert. He wrote that he had met with Charles, and that they had talked. Charles was angry, but he still listened to him. They agreed to try to rebuild their relationship, step by step, slowly. I felt mixed emotions, relief and pain at the same time. I was happy for them, but at the same time, I felt as if I was finally losing what had once been my family. I replied to Robert briefly, congratulating him and saying I hoped they could find common ground. He thanked me, and that was the end of our communication. I realized he also wanted to start a new life without me, and perhaps that was for the best for everyone. The days dragged on endlessly. I stopped leaving the house. I avoided people, friends, acquaintances, fearing their looks and questions. Inside me, there was a feeling of emptiness that I could not fill. I could not get rid of the thought that I had destroyed not only my life, but also the lives of those I loved. I couldn't forgive myself for it. I spent a lot of time thinking about what would come next, but I found no answer. The future seemed unclear, frightening. It seemed to me that I would never be able to feel happy again, that I would never be able to forgive myself for everything that had happened. I didn't know what to do, how to move forward. I was alone, completely alone, and each day the loneliness grew stronger. And in that silence, in the cold of my loneliness, I understood one thing. I realized that I had a long road ahead of me, a path to understanding myself, to finding the strength within me to move on, to learn how to forgive others, and most importantly, myself. This path would not be easy, I knew that, but I also knew that I would have to walk it alone, and perhaps, one day, I could find the answer to the question that had tormented me all this time. What does it mean to love and be loved, and how to find balance in that without destroying my life or the lives of those around me? This was my new reality, a reality in which I was alone, but where I could still find myself. I realized that life goes on no matter what, and I had to find the strength within myself to keep living, even if I didn't know how just yet.